Vincent Romano hadn't bowed to anyone in 40 years, but tonight he stood outside the ICU of Mount Sinai Hospital in Manhattan with trembling hands. Inside that sterile room, his empire meant nothing. 20 of the nation's top physicians had examined his condition over the past 72 hours, and every single one wore the same expression: controlled panic disguised as professional concern. The boss of the Lucchese crime family had collapsed during a business meeting at his restaurant in Little Italy. One moment he was discussing shipping routes, the next he was convulsing on the marble floor. His men rushed him to Mount Sinai, where his lawyer had arranged for the best medical team money could buy, but money couldn't diagnose what was killing him. Dr. Richard Morrison, chief of internal medicine, emerged from the ICU looking 10 years older than when he'd entered his shift. His reputation had been built on impossible diagnoses, yet Vincent Romano's case defied every test, every theory, every expert consultation. The symptoms made no sense: intermittent paralysis, cardiac arrhythmias, cognitive disturbances, and a toxicology screen that showed nothing unusual. "We've ruled out stroke, heart attack, poisoning, autoimmune disorders, and every infectious disease known to medicine," Morrison told Vincent's eldest son, Marco, in the hallway. "His organs are shutting down, but we can't identify the cause. I've consulted with specialists from Johns Hopkins, Mayo Clinic, and Massachusetts General. Everyone is baffled." Marco Romano's jaw tightened. In their world, failure had consequences. "My father has 72 hours at most, and you're telling me the best doctors in America can't figure out what's wrong with him?" On the 4th floor, far from the executive suites and private rooms, Maria Santos pushed her cleaning cart past the ICU. She had worked the night shift at Mount Sinai for 11 years, invisible to most doctors and nurses. At 53, her hands were weathered from industrial cleaners, her back ached from bending over floors, but her eyes remained sharp, observant. Maria had cleaned Vincent Romano's room 3 times since his admission. She'd emptied trash bins filled with medical reports, wiped down equipment covered in electrode gel, and mopped floors where specialists had paced while debating diagnoses. And she'd noticed something that 20 brilliant physicians had missed. It started with the smell, a faint, almost imperceptible odor that clung to Romano's hospital gown and bedsheets, something chemical mixed with something organic. Maria recognized it from her childhood in rural Colombia, where her grandmother had taught her about plants, both medicinal and deadly. The second thing she noticed was the pattern. Romano's symptoms intensified exactly 2 hours after each meal, then subsided around hour 5. But Maria Santos was a cleaning lady, an immigrant woman whose medical knowledge came from folk remedies and careful observation, not prestigious universities. Who would listen to her? She'd seen enough of hospital hierarchy to know that doctors barely acknowledged nurses, let alone janitors. Speaking up meant risking her job, her visa status, her daughter's college fund. Still, as she watched Marco Romano's desperate face through the ICU window, as she heard the machines monitoring Vincent's failing body, Maria made a decision. She waited until Dr. Morrison left for his office, then approached the nurse's station, where Marco stood alone, studying his father through the glass. "Mr. Romano," she said quietly in accented English, her heart hammering, "I need to tell you something about your father. Something the doctors haven't seen." Marco turned, surprised to be addressed by hospital staff he'd barely registered. His expression shifted from annoyance to curiosity as he studied the small woman in the blue cleaning uniform, who stood before him with unusual intensity. "I think I know what's making your father sick," Maria continued, her voice steady despite her fear. "But you need to make the doctors listen to me, and you need to do it now, before it's too late." Marco Romano studied the cleaning woman before him with the same calculating gaze he used to assess business rivals. In his world, information came from unexpected sources: a waiter who overheard conversations, a parking attendant who noticed patterns, a cleaning lady who saw what others missed. His father had taught him that power came not just from commanding respect, but from recognizing value wherever it appeared. "You have 60 seconds, Marco said, checking his platinum watch. "Convince me you're not wasting my time." Maria took a breath and spoke quickly. "Your father's symptoms start 2 hours after he eats, yes? The paralysis, the heart problems, the confusion, then they get better, then worse again. The doctors test for poison, but find nothing because they're looking for common toxins. They're not testing for plant alkaloids, specifically granotoxins from rhododendron honey." Marco's expression shifted. "How would you know about something the specialists missed?" "Because I grew up in a region of Colombia where this happens," Maria explained, her confidence growing. "Mad honey poisoning. It's rare, but I saw it as a child. A neighbor nearly died from it. The symptoms match exactly: low blood pressure, bradycardia, altered mental status, paralysis that comes and goes. And there's a smell on your father's sheets and gown that none of the doctors would recognize because they're focused on their machines and tests. But I know that smell." She pulled a small notebook from her uniform pocket, pages filled with careful observations written in Spanish. "I've been cleaning your father's room for 3 days. I documented when his symptoms spike, when they improve, what was in the trash each time. Look at the pattern. It's not random." Marco took the notebook, scanning the neat handwriting and timestamps. Despite himself, he was impressed by the methodical documentation. "If you're right, how is he being poisoned? Everything he eats is brought from our family restaurant and tasted by my cousin first. His water is bottled and sealed. His medications are administered by nurses." "That's what you need to figure out," Maria said. "I can tell you what's poisoning him. You need to find out who is doing it and how. But first, you need to make the doctors test for granotoxins. They won't do it on my word. They need to hear it from you, from someone they respect." Before Marco could respond, 2 nurses rushed past them into the ICU. Alarms sounded from Vincent's room. Dr. Morrison appeared seconds later, running toward the emergency. Through the window, they could see Vincent convulsing, his body rigid as medical staff surrounded his bed. "That's the 3rd crisis today," Maria said urgently. "Each one is worse. Mr. Romano, your father doesn't have time for the doctors to figure this out through trial and error. If I'm right, the treatment is simple: atropine and supportive care. If I'm wrong, testing for it won't hurt him. But if you wait for them to exhaust every other possibility first, he'll be dead." Marco made his decision. He pulled out his phone and made 2 calls. The first was to his family's lawyer, instructing him to contact the hospital's chief administrator immediately. The second was to his Uncle Sal, telling him to bring certain documents from the restaurant, documents that tracked every person who had access to Vincent's food. Then Marco Romano, a man accustomed to command, walked into the ICU, where 20 specialists struggled to save his father. "Everyone stop," he announced, his voice cutting through the chaos. "I have new information about his condition. Someone page toxicology immediately. We need to test for something called granotoxins." Dr. Morrison looked up from the crash cart, irritated at the interruption. "Mr. Romano, we're in the middle of a medical emergency. We've already done extensive toxicology screening." "Not for this you haven't," Marco said coldly. "My source says it's mad honey poisoning, rhododendron alkaloids. Test for it now, or I'm moving my father to another hospital, and your reputation will be the least of your problems." The room fell silent. Dr. Morrison's face flushed with anger at being challenged by a patient's family member, but something in Marco's tone made him pause. "What source? Who told you about granotoxins?" Marco gestured toward the doorway where Maria stood, still clutching her cleaning cart. 20 pairs of eyes turned to stare at the small woman in the blue uniform. Dr. Morrison's expression shifted from anger to disbelief to barely contained condescension. "Your source is the cleaning staff," Morrison said, his tone dismissive. "Mr. Romano, I understand you're desperate, but we can't change our treatment protocol based on the suggestions of someone without medical training. This hospital operates on evidence-based medicine, not folk remedies." Maria stepped forward, her fear evaporating in the face of Morrison's arrogance. She'd spent 11 years being invisible, being dismissed, but Vincent Romano's life hung in the balance, and she knew she was right. "Dr. Morrison," she said clearly, her accent suddenly less pronounced, "before I came to America, I studied 3 years at Universidad Nacional de Colombia's medical school. I couldn't finish my degree because of the Civil War, but I learned enough to recognize what you're missing. Test his blood for greyanotoxin levels. Look for bradycardia and hypotension that responds poorly to standard treatments. Check if his symptoms correlate with food intake. And while you're deciding whether my lack of credentials makes my observations invalid, consider that your patient is dying because 20 of America's finest doctors were too proud to notice what the cleaning lady saw." The ICU was absolutely silent. Then Vincent Romano's heart monitor emitted a long, continuous tone. "Flatline." "We need to intubate now!" someone shouted. The room exploded into controlled chaos as the medical team fought to restart Vincent Romano's heart while Maria Santos stood in the doorway, praying she'd spoken up in time. Vincent Romano's heart restarted after 47 seconds of CPR, but his condition remained critical. Dr. Morrison, shaken by how close they'd come to losing the patient, ordered the greyanotoxin test, along with a full review of everything that had entered Vincent's room since admission. His pride stung from being challenged by a cleaning woman, but his career depended on Vincent Romano surviving, and he could no longer afford to ignore any possibility. The blood samples went to the hospital's advanced toxicology lab with a rush priority that required administrator approval. Marco's lawyer had made calls that rippled through the hospital's executive offices, ensuring cooperation at every level. While they waited for results, Marco turned his attention to the question Maria had posed: who was poisoning his father, and how? He brought Maria into his father's private security office on the hospital's ground floor, a room his family had arranged within hours of Vincent's admission. The walls were covered with surveillance footage, visitor logs, and detailed records of everyone who'd had access to Vincent's floor. Marco's cousin Tony, the family's head of security, stood beside a whiteboard covered with names and timestamps. "Walk me through your theory," Marco said to Maria, who sat nervously in a leather chair far more expensive than anything in her apartment. "If it's the honey, how is it being administered? We control his food, his water, everything." Maria studied the whiteboard, her analytical mind engaging with the puzzle. Greyanotoxins are concentrated in honey made from rhododendron nectar. It's mostly found in Turkey, Nepal, and parts of the Black Sea region. The honey looks normal, but causes toxicity even in small amounts. Your father wouldn't taste anything unusual if someone added a spoonful to his food or dissolved it in a hot beverage. "But we've been paranoid about his food since day one," Tony interrupted, pointing to the logs. "Every meal comes from Lombardi's, our family restaurant. Angelo prepares it himself, and I taste everything before it leaves the kitchen. The delivery driver is my brother-in-law. The containers are sealed. How would someone tamper with it between the restaurant and this room?" Maria was quiet for a moment, thinking. "What about after it arrives? Who handles the food once it's here?" Marco and Tony exchanged glances. "The nurses warm it up in the floor's kitchen," Tony admitted. "They plate it, add utensils. There's usually a 5 to 10 minute window between when I deliver it to the nurses' station and when they bring it to the room." "That's your gap," Maria said firmly. "Someone with access to that kitchen is adding the toxin while the food is being prepared for serving. You're watching the food's journey to the hospital, but you're not watching the last 10 feet. Marco pulled up surveillance footage on his laptop. The hospital had cameras covering public areas, but not inside staff break rooms or service kitchens. Tony made a phone call, and within minutes, they had security reviewing all footage of the fourth-floor nurse's kitchen over the past 3 days, focusing on who entered when Vincent's meals were being prepared. While they worked, Dr. Morrison called Marco's phone. The toxicology results were back. The test was positive. Vincent Romano had significant levels of greyanotoxin in his blood, consistent with repeated exposure over approximately 72 hours. Morrison's voice, normally confident to the point of arrogance, carried a note of humble shock. "The cleaning woman was right," Morrison said. "We're starting atropine treatment now and providing supportive care to stabilize his cardiovascular system. If we'd tested for this yesterday, before his condition deteriorated this far, his prognosis would be significantly better. As it stands, the next 24 hours are critical. We nearly killed him by not listening." Marco hung up and looked at Maria with new respect. "You saved my father's life. That deserves more than thanks. It deserves answers. We're going to find out who did this, and you're going to help us, if you're willing." Maria nodded slowly. She'd crossed a line by speaking up, and there was no going back now. Besides, her curiosity was now fully engaged. Someone had been systematically poisoning a mafia boss under the noses of 20 specialists and sophisticated security. The mystery demanded solving. Tony's phone buzzed. The security team had found something. On the surveillance footage from the past 3 days, the same nurse appeared in the fourth-floor kitchen during the exact windows when Vincent's meals were being prepared. Her name was Jennifer Walsh, 32 years old, employed at Mount Sinai for 4 years, with an exemplary record. But in each clip, she could be seen standing near Vincent's food tray with her back to the camera, her body blocking the view of what her hands were doing. "Pull everything on Walsh," Marco ordered. "Financial records, phone logs, associates, travel history, and do it quietly. If she realizes we're onto her, she might disappear or destroy evidence." Within 2 hours, they had their answer. Jennifer Walsh had made 3 trips to Istanbul, Turkey over the past year, unusual for a nurse on a hospital salary. Her bank records showed cash deposits totaling $40,000 in the past 6 months, with no clear source. And most damning, her phone records showed repeated calls to a number registered to Vincent Romano's estranged nephew, Eddie Romano, who'd been cut out of the family business 3 years earlier after stealing from the organization. "Eddie," Marco said, the name tasting bitter. "That ungrateful piece of trash. My father gave him chances, forgave him twice, and this is how he repays that mercy?" Tony's expression was cold. "What do you want to do?" Marco thought carefully. They had evidence of the conspiracy, but involving the police meant exposing family business to law enforcement scrutiny. The Romano family had their own methods of justice, but they also had to consider Maria's safety. She'd stumbled into something dangerous, and she'd saved Vincent's life. That created obligations. "First, we protect Maria," Marco said, looking at the cleaning woman who'd become an unlikely ally. "You live in Queens, right? Daughter at NYU? As of today, you both have 24-hour security until this is resolved. Second, we document everything we've found and turn it over to the hospital administration and the DA's office. Walsh goes down legally, no shortcuts. Eddie can be handled through family channels, but the nurse faces public justice. And third, Maria, you're going to meet with Dr. Morrison and the hospital board tomorrow to ensure everyone knows that you saved a life that their specialists couldn't." Maria looked stunned. "Mr. Romano, I just want my job and my life back. I don't need recognition or reward. Your father is alive. That's enough." "It's not enough," Marco said firmly. "You risked everything to speak up when no one would listen. That courage deserves protection and acknowledgement. My family pays its debts, Maria. All of them." The dawn light filtered through Mount Sinai Hospital's windows as Vincent Romano opened his eyes for the first time in 4 days. The grey anotoxin treatment had worked, slowly purging the poison from his system while atropine stabilized his heart rhythm. Dr. Morrison stood at his bedside, monitoring vitals with the careful attention of a man who'd nearly lost both a patient and his reputation. "You had us scared, Vincent," Morrison admitted quietly. 20 specialists couldn't figure out what was killing you. A cleaning lady solved it in 3 days by paying attention to details we were too proud to notice. Vincent's voice was weak but clear. "I want to meet her, this cleaning lady who's smarter than all of you combined." In a conference room 3 floors below, Jennifer Walsh sat between 2 attorneys provided by the hospital, facing questions from NYPD detectives and representatives from the district attorney's office. The evidence against her was overwhelming: bank records, travel documents, surveillance footage, and phone logs connecting her to Eddie Romano. When confronted with the proof, her composure cracked. "Eddie said it would look like natural causes," she said, tears streaming down her face. "He said his uncle had enemies, that he was a bad man who deserved it, and that we'd be rich once Vincent was dead, and Eddie inherited his share of the family business. I needed the money. My student loans, my mother's medical bills. I was drowning financially. Eddie offered me a way out." "So you poisoned a patient under your care?" the detective said flatly. "You violated every oath you took as a nurse. You planned murder for $40,000. Eddie said no one would know, that the doctors would think it was his heart or a stroke. He gave me the honey in Istanbul, showed me how to dissolve just enough in hot water to add to the food. Small amounts spread over time to make it look like natural decline. But then that cleaning woman started asking questions, watching the room. I knew she'd noticed something, but I thought no one would listen to her. I didn't expect her to be believed." Jennifer Walsh was arrested and charged with attempted murder and conspiracy. Eddie Romano disappeared the night his role in the plot was discovered, but the Romano family had long memories and even longer reach. He wouldn't stay hidden forever. The following afternoon, Maria Santos stood in Vincent Romano's private recovery room, uncomfortable in the formal dress that Marco's wife had insisted she wear. She'd wanted to refuse this meeting, to return to her invisible existence pushing a cleaning cart. But Marco had been insistent. The Romano family had obligations to fulfill. Vincent studied her from his hospital bed. His color improved, but his body still weak from the ordeal. Beside him stood Marco and Tony, along with the hospital's chief administrator and Dr. Morrison, whose expression mixed embarrassment with genuine respect. "Maria Santos," Vincent said slowly, "you saved my life when 24 of America's finest physicians couldn't. You risked your job and possibly your safety to speak up when no one would listen. In my world, that kind of loyalty and courage creates bonds that last lifetimes. You have my family's gratitude and protection, now and always." "I just did what was right," Maria said quietly. "I saw something wrong and I spoke up. Anyone would have done the same." "But they didn't," Morrison interjected. 20 specialists missed what you caught because we were too focused on complex explanations when the answer was simpler. You demonstrated that clinical observation and critical thinking aren't limited to those with medical degrees. You've humbled us all, and you've reminded me why I became a doctor in the first place. To see what others miss, and to save lives." The hospital administrator cleared his throat. "Miss Santos, the hospital board has reviewed your case and your background. We understand you completed 3 years of medical school in Colombia before circumstances forced you to leave. We'd like to offer you a position in our patient advocacy program while sponsoring your completion of medical education through our partnership program with NYU. You'd work part-time at the hospital while finishing your degree, full tuition, salary and benefits. Maria's eyes filled with tears. She'd given up on that dream 15 years ago when she'd fled Colombia with her infant daughter, leaving behind her studies to build a new life as a cleaning woman in New York. Now that door was opening again, offered by the very institution where she'd been invisible for over a decade. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say yes," Vincent replied, managing a smile despite his weakness. "Say yes. Finish your education and become the doctor you were meant to be. The world needs physicians who see what others miss, who have the courage to challenge authority when lives are at stake. You've already proven you have those qualities." 3 months later, Maria Santos walked across the NYU Medical School campus as a returning student, her daughter Anna beside her, both of them carrying backpacks and dreams. The Romano family had kept their word, providing not just financial support, but also the security and advocacy that allowed Maria to transform her life without fear. Vincent Romano, recovered fully, returned to his business with renewed appreciation for the unexpected allies who emerged from unlikely places. He funded a scholarship program at Mount Sinai for healthcare workers seeking to complete interrupted medical educations, naming it after Maria Santos over her embarrassed objections. Dr. Morrison reformed his department's protocols, implementing a system where observations from all hospital staff, from janitors to administrators, could be reported and reviewed when patients' conditions puzzled the medical teams. The Santos Protocol, as it became known, saved 17 lives in its first year by ensuring that crucial observations weren't dismissed due to the observer's position in the hospital hierarchy. Jennifer Walsh pleaded guilty to attempted murder and received a 15-year sentence. Eddie Romano was found 6 months later in Sicily, where the long arm of family justice finally reached him. The details of his fate were never made public, but the Romano family's message was clear. Betrayal carried permanent consequences. On the anniversary of Vincent's recovery, Maria Santos, now in her final year of medical school, returned to Mount Sinai Hospital for a ceremony honoring her courage and diagnostic insight. She stood in the same ICU where she'd first dared to speak up, now wearing a white coat, with her name embroidered above the pocket, no longer invisible, but celebrated. "I used to think that being ignored made me powerless," Maria told the gathered crowd of doctors, nurses, and administrators. "But power isn't about having credentials or authority. It's about having the courage to use your knowledge and observations to make a difference, regardless of whether anyone is listening." That night, I chose to speak up, even though I knew I might be dismissed or punished. That choice saved a life and changed mine. Never underestimate the power of seeing what others miss and having the courage to say something, even when no one wants to hear it from you. The applause that followed echoed through the ICU, a sound of recognition for the cleaning lady who'd seen what 20 doctors had missed, who'd proven that genius and courage can emerge from the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the most valuable insights come from those society renders invisible. Vincent Romano, watching from the audience with his family beside him, nodded in satisfaction. In his world, debts were always paid, and loyalty was rewarded. Maria Santos had given him back his life, and he'd given her back her dreams. It was, he reflected, the best deal he'd ever made.